This episode is sponsored by viewers like you and Skillshare. Get 2 free months by clicking on the link below. More on that after the video. Hey, Cypher here. Back in the Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee episode, I mentioned doing an episode on how historians killed the Western genre. Well, this is me working towards that. And I even worked this project into a term paper. The Western died in the critical years of 1968 to 75. So Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is the first based on a true story movie I watched to see the changeover during that time. The Wild Bunch came out the same year as this, in 1969, but it wasn't based on anything, because if it had been, then it would have been another hole-in-the-wall gang movie like this one. Talk about odd timing. This film, on the other hand, is forgivably inaccurate. Most of what it gets wrong doesn't affect the story too much, but it also simply doesn't care about telling a particularly true story. George Roy Hill and William Goldman, the director and writer, were more concerned with what they could do within the stories of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and they managed to make a pretty good movie despite the inaccuracies. It got snubbed at the Oscars for Midnight Cowboy.
We have nominated the Academy these films as the 5 best pictures of the year. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The winner is Midnight Cowboy.
Yuck. Which is often considered one of the worst Oscar snubs in Hollywood history. As you guys might know, I have a deep and abiding passion for old westerns. So I'm on board with this assessment. Though it did end up winning the 4 out of 7 Oscars it was nominated for. But Robert Redford created his own film festival in 1978, which eventually bared his character's name, the Sundance Film Festival. So this movie has some influence. Just think, Sundance movies are named for a film that is based on a true story. That true story is the real Wild Bunch, assembled by Butch Cassidy. Butch Cassidy was born to a Mormon family and named Robert LeRoy Parker, after the patriarch of the family, though he preferred Bob back then. He began his criminal career by accident when he was conned into taking the blame for some fraudulent cattle sales. So he ran from home and worked as a cowboy. He broke into a closed shop in 1880, because he'd ridden too far to wait for it to open, apparently. Well, the shop owner didn't like the IOU he left on the counter, so he brought Bob Parker up on charges, but they didn't stick. 9 years later, he had grown tired of working as a horse jockey, so he robbed a bank. After escaping to Robber's Roost, he bought up a ranch in Wyoming, but he didn't go legitimate. Instead, he continued rustling and maybe even running a protection racket with his outlaw girlfriend, Ann Bassett. After he spent 18 months in jail for his crimes, he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. The newly renamed Butch Cassidy began gathering other criminals into a place called Hole in the Wall, where Queen Anne, as she was called, had a ranch. And it was another place where people could easily hide out. They took their name from the old Doolin gang, the Wild Bunch, which the original version was an offshoot of the Dalton gang. The Wild Bunch has been calculated to be as big as 40 members and as small as 18, but it's difficult to tell who was a member or simply a one-time acquaintance. These guys basically did the same thing as the original Wild Bunch, robbing all over the West. The only difference was that they were notably less violent, managing not to kill anyone during their robberies, though that would change. After robbing a passenger train near Wilcox, Wyoming in 1899, their number was up. Sheriffs raised posses throughout southern Wyoming to hunt them down. A sheriff managed to find 2 of the Wild Bunch, but he was gunned down while trying to arrest them. This shifted the manhunt into overdrive, even bringing in private detectives for the hunt. More shootouts happened, with 3 lawmen killed, but the Wild Bunch kept robbing all over the place. They were the most famous outlaws still operating at the turn of the century, but by 1901, things were too hot for them to continue. Cassidy took the Sundance Kid and the kid's girlfriend down to Argentina to farm for a while. Several members of the gang were killed or arrested in the early 1900s, killing many lawmen in the process. The last of the gang to be killed was Ben Kilpatrick, who was released from prison in 1911 and killed during a train robbery a year later. Bank robberies continued, but the time of train robbing was finished. Butch and Sundance probably started their criminal career back up again while in Argentina around 1905, but ended up going north toward Bolivia. Sundance's girlfriend left in 1906, and 2 American bandits wound up dead during a shootout in Bolivia in 1908. Since Bolivians couldn't identify the bandits, this has led to speculation that Butch and Sundance weren't the ones killed down there. But as one historian puts it rather succinctly, these theories are total horsepucky. This is one of those tales that have been told and retold so many times that the reality behind it is difficult to parse out. Luckily, their misadventures happened so late in the game that dime novelists never took hold of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. But that doesn't stop mythmakers. Newspapers and later accounts pushed their exploits and reinforced the idea that they were a peaceful version of the original Wild Bunch. This was false, given the amount of people they killed. I mean, one member by the alias of Harvey Logan could have killed as many as 16 people. That's not jovial robberies. That's Cassidy repressing the violent tendencies of his gang. Luckily, this was too late in the game for this mythology to take too much of a hold. Hobsbawm's social banditry theory hasn't been applied yet, and thank goodness. I really hate dealing with that myth. People love their Robin Hood archetypes, no matter how inaccurate it is or how much violence that causes. But there is one legend that has stuck around. People like to speculate how Butch and Sundance might have survived and returned to America. These theories range from pretty silly to absolutely insane. The only reason why I wouldn't call them conspiracy theories is that they are not denying evidence. They are simply using the fact that Butch and Sundance are not the ones identified in the 1908 Bolivian shootout. Due to claims of seeing him, theories normally revolve around Butch returning in 1925, and eventually dying in southern Nevada in the 1950s. Historians generally scoff at this idea due to the lack of evidence, but that doesn't stop people from trying. It all hinges on claims made by old-timers that are distantly related to Butch, such as Ann Bassett's sister, claiming to have seen Butch in the 1920s, 40 years after the fact. She was 86 years old. As one historian said about such claims, people have a way of remembering questionable events in famous people's lives after they become famous. Historians have done the research necessary, especially after this film came out. There actually was plenty of documentation, so they've been able to find a lot of material on most of the members. This seems to have happened a lot in the 1970s, as more and more legendary outlaws were realistically rendered by historians. As the Western died, those who loved the genre sought to find the reality behind its myths, and were often fairly disappointed. Instead of outsized men of great heroism, they found complex and nuanced people. Who wants nuanced storytelling, right? But the movie didn't have all that to help it. Instead, it had mostly legendary accounts. Luckily, they stuck to the broad strokes instead, and made it into a kind of buddy movie, really fleshing out the characters themselves. The basics of the story are left intact. They also chose to focus on the latter part of the story rather than the earlier stuff, which is one of those things I keep asking of films. None of this cradle-to-grave crap. Keep it within the filmmaker's capabilities. That's what I want to see. There's also a kind of tongue-in-cheek feel to the whole thing. It's rather comedic at times.
Well, that ought to do it.
Think you used enough dynamite there, Butch?
Sure, we don't have the information to know if they were this jovial, but it's plausible.
I got nervous. I forgot the word. Shoot me.
You've had worse ideas lately.
Plus, it gives one the sense of not taking everything too seriously. More movies need to do this. If they're going to lampoon things, do so in a way that helps characterize these people and renders their characters close to what they would recognize. Having read of their exploits, it sounds like this would be recognizable. It also helps to avoid the social banditry myth. We aren't supposed to see these guys as good, or fighting for a just cause. They're greedy lowlives whose misdeeds cannot be redeemed. Instead, they're likable only in the fact that their characters are likable. Just like we would see a con man. That's good characterization.
You just keep thinking, Butch. That's what you're good at. Boy, I got vision and the rest of the world wears bifocals.
A fascinatingly true part of this film is the guy who tries to stop the gang from robbing the cars he's tasked with protecting.
You got a patriot in there. Okay, go ahead, Newt.
That's young Woodcock. He's awful dedicated.
Woodcock!
Yes, sir.
That was a real dude, and he totally gave in the second time he was getting robbed. But as soon as the story is done with that character, that's where the real inaccuracies start to show up. They accidentally blow up a train car trying to get cash, and then immediately get chased by a posse coming from a following car. That's not remotely accurate. None of that happened, and this half-hour-long chase scene would be more accurate if it were done with one of the other outlaws. Butch and Sundance didn't experience a chase like this, but that doesn't mean the gang as a whole didn't. The ruthless detective on their trail was very real, but the tracker wasn't.
Who are those guys? Who are those guys? Who are those guys?
Who are those guys?
Though the detective is mischaracterized here. The point of this scene is to relay that they have to flee the country, and that's true to life. I guess we could call that inaccuracy amalgamation, but it actually only barely affects the overarching narrative. What is odd is when they say this.
We want to illustrate. No, in the army. Right away. Go fight the Spanish.
But much of what is depicted is after the war was over. So it doesn't make sense for them to constantly talk of escaping into the army.
He's going off to fight the war.
What war?
The war with the Spanish.
Remember them?
I get what the film is going for, but it renders their escape attempt with a sympathetic sheriff meaningless. I'd harp on that some more, but really, it's in passing. The real inaccuracy is the constant emphasis on non-violence.
Kid, there's something I think I ought to tell you. I never shot anybody before.
One hell of a time to tell me.
As we saw, the gang did in fact kill several people. So while Butch might never have actually killed, it is dishonest to imply that the Wild Bunch never killed anyone. They were certainly less violent than the Doolin version, but inevitably ended up killing folks. The gang is also depicted as being far fewer in number than were actually in it. Amalgamation is okay, but it can't serve as an excuse for making these guys seem peaceful. That being said, the end is also highly inaccurate in the opposite way. It is this big, epic battle with the Bolivian army arriving in time to utterly annihilate Butch and Sundance. What really happened was the two gringos were only surrounded by locals before they died. It's also possible that they killed each other instead of continuing the fight. The Bolivian army arrived afterwards. So this whole finale and romantic ending is, well, simply romanticization, which is par for the course with these things, I guess. Even though there is a lot of accuracy here,
You know who we are.
and plenty of room for fiction, that can lead to myth-making. That is not necessarily a bad thing, but no one can deny that this movie contributed to the American frontier myth. It emphasizes the standard Frederick Jackson Turner narrative in its mythologizing, but in a way that was fairly new for 1969. The times were a-changin' for the myth, and this movie contributed to that. To refresh, the basic idea of the frontier thesis is that there were waves of civilization moving west, meeting the wilderness, and taming it. First came the frontiersmen, then land users like cowboys, and finally settlers. Each successive wave regressed to a more primitive state, but remade the nation in the process of civilizing the frontier. Get it? I've seen people complain that I use the Searchers as a quintessential version of this myth, because it points to racism as a bad thing, but that isn't really the message there. The message is that the protagonist's racism is a bad thing, but the implicit problem of savages being the equivalent of the uncivilized wilderness is not challenged. The racism of the frontier itself is written within the very story, regardless of its individual characters' aspirations. So, what was different about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? It does have your typical homage to the standard myth, like this.
Future's all yours, you lousy bicycles.
But there's a bit of change we can see. First, the whole buddy comedy stuff was a way around the idea of social banditry. The audience doesn't see their brazen acts as cool and worthy of heroism.
Well, just thought I'd watch.
Instead, we see them as hoodlums out for a laugh, doing it to continue paying for their decadent lifestyle in the rough and tumble West. There's also a comeuppance for that lifestyle.
But you're still nothing but two-bit outlaws on the dodge. It's over. Don't you get that? Your times is over, and you're gonna die bloody. And all you can do is choose where.
And that comes with them being killed in Bolivia. There's no gentle end to their story, or for any gangster. They don't just fade back into the wilderness from whence they came, but are violently destroyed by the civilization they preyed upon. Even when they try to go straight, the wilderness has made them regress too much.
But we've gone straight. What do we try now?
They're not seen as ignoble heroes or merely tainted, but wholeheartedly malicious harbingers of the very civilization that destroys them. The film has its problems with race, too. For instance, when they make it to Bolivia, they try working for an American miner.
And you are just what I'm looking for, on top of which you stem from the US of A. We start tomorrow morning.
He thoroughly disparages the country by saying,
Bingo. I'm colorful. That's what happens when you live 10 years alone in Bolivia. You get colorful.
This goes unchallenged, and in fact, the duo reinforce it.
What could they have here that you could possibly want to buy?
So in a way, they transpose the frontier myth onto South America, effectively rendering its inhabitants the new savages to be conquered. But there's some concurrent events that were distorting the frontier myth, and I'm purposefully avoiding them here. Thus far, I've only talked about the movie and its factual basis, but think what was going on in 1969, and why the roles of race and violence needed to be re-envisioned for the coming years. What was driving this change? Well, you'll just have to wait for that, when I finally do an episode on the death of the Western. That's going to be a huge episode. So I'll leave you with that cliffhanger.
The fall will probably kill you.
Before jumping off that cliff, you might want to learn how to swim with today's sponsor, Skillshare.
Lane segue.
Hey, I'm not a comedy genius. Although... Yep, I think I know what class I need to take. But you really can learn how to swim with Skillshare. See, they've got classes on even that. You can stream classes and build your skills on a variety of topics. They've got stuff on business, tech, creative work, and much, much more. If you click on the link below, you can get 2 free months of premium, and it only costs $10 a month after that. So go click that link. And thanks, Skillshare, for sponsoring this episode.